deflect, disrupt, and even disturb. The question of artists not to be engaged, but as invited guests, but rather to engage themselves when and how and where they will. The question of instrumentalism of the arts and artists, the curation of niche markets for climate art as a style, the role of the public arts institutions to engage in relevant issues were obviously some of the things that were talked and thrown about. The overriding sort of theme of climate change and sustainability gives us, however, artists, cultural sector, indeed cultural context, the opportunity to redefine itself in a world which increasingly demands creative solutions, and this way also questions the current cultural deficit in society in general. One of the most debated issues in Denmark the last 3 years, after the so-called crisis of the cartoons, which was in 2006, just prior to something which Olaf was deeply involved and I became involved in, which is the images of the Middle East as a sort of an event in this country. And it's a debate which is still going on and which still has very political connotations, and it's about the right of the freedom of speech for artists. And very little was discussed with something which I feel is very prevalent here and very important. It's the commitment of the responsibility of the freedom of speech. The responsibility of freedom of speech actually demanding that artists just not use the power or the ability to say what they want, where they want, when they want, and to whom they want and how they want, but actually are committed to be responsible of that particular role and are aware of when and where their voices are needed. And this is one of the first things I think which is very, very important. It's also quite interesting to look at the way the COP15 is structured, physically and organisationally. We have well-defined area of the arts, which is pretty much separated from the well-defined area of the politicians or the politics. And then we have the well-defined area of the business world and the technical world, and the well-defined activists of the political activists who are relegated to the streets. So we've kind of divided the city into these spheres of influence, which is actually the same problem which you might see has been put on the board here. These spheres of influence and power and silos of thinking and language and statistics and models and so on is one of the problems. It's very difficult to negotiate and create these common platforms where things could be interacted in a more fluid way. And we kind of risk being the arts. I mean, what is a problem, particularly although there are a huge number of programs on, they risk being sidetracked as the after hours, the late night, the social, the pretty, the funny, the quirky. And that's one of the problems, of course, with staging arts in such a context. Well, of course, it's better we're here than not being here at all, but the dilemma is clear. So we sorely need new arenas where these, what I would say, we're in a time of, or an era of converging interest and not diverging interests. We're aware there are themes of converging interests, converging codes, languages are interacting, and they need to be done in a more fluid, creative way. And the realization of converging interests, overlapping spheres, complex problems, this question of simplicity and complexity we might be able to take up afterwards, and the situations invites and almost demands a new positioning of the arts and culture sector. Sustainable organisations and meeting places are a prerequisite for actually sustainable living, and this is what perhaps we could provide. So this is, in a way, the first challenge, and it's quite an obvious challenge standing here and saying the role of the public institutions, the role of the public arts institutions. And these all have a sense of urgency. We need to really looking at the first decade of this millennium. We've been confronted with a series of crises which are really eroding and battering down our preconceived ideas about how we have structured this world. And it's questioning not only value systems but also our evaluating system, our evolution system, and also thereby our evading systems. These things which we all know about is in a way a kind of a decade of a series of real but also constructed and also imagined conflicts have dominated and demanded a new terminology, rather than promoting existing demagogy. After the postmodern, after the post-industrial and the post-information society era has played itself out in a kind of decreasing spiral, and it's left around in fragmented debris, religious polarization, shallow consumerism, searching souls, battered inner cities, drying tundras and deforested equatorial regions. So in this context, the role of the artist and the definition of artwork, the definition of the role of cultural organizers, curators, the cultural infrastructure is not relevant for just its own sake, to question its own sustainability, its own values, but these roles are also relevant for society as such, and need to be far more relevant in the cultural domain. And in connected with climate crisis, as with the other crises, which unfortunately seem primarily still in the domain of the technical, the financial and the political spheres. And our interests, of course, in keeping those in the political, the technical, the financial spheres, and maybe also the religious spheres as well. But these spheres of influence, and the question is whether we have to define ourselves as a sphere of influence, a sector, or we actually can actually be the translator, the interpreter. However, most of these problems we're talking about, as been talked about before, are in fact culturally defined and contextualized crises. And as we all know, we have to define the question in the right way to at all get to the right answers as conveyors of, and as we are actually, you might say, conveyors of meaning, tradition and identities, as well as methods, innovation and creativity. And then we might be able to create this sort of more open source field, where diversity is not just a question of typological representation, but a dynamic and organic interactive mass, and where integration is not a question of sublimation acceptance, but a mindset where oppositional information can be processed in a humanistic, an open humanistic and supportive environment, and where questions of cultural infrastructure must be prepared to be creative and think creative. So this is our challenge. So signs of repositioning the arts, actually, and arts institutions are everywhere, and signs of re-engagement are everywhere. From implicit and individual reflections from artists moving to larger networked answers and processes and structured attempts are indeed flourishing. And you can see I was chair of the government's board to manage a grant to give to the COP15 cultural programme and the NGO programme. And looked through hundreds of proposals and hundreds of ideas, and it was quite, more than anything, touched actually by the honesty of the will to engage and the honesty to make, in many cases, huge sacrifices to actually be allowed to play a role in this project. So although I can almost tongue-in-cheek put it down as being marginal, of course it's not marginal from the point of view of the people who took part and the people who are actually producing these things. It's really heartfelt and sincere, and that's very, of course, very encouraging. But there's also been other things. There's been a massive Nordic exhibition a couple of years ago. Particularly in the UK, there's a huge engagement in the visual arts within this sector. There are some wonderful urban innovators in Germany, and we could go on and on and on. There are amazing things happens where, and I also looked at it, could appreciate this myself in 2007 when we launched a new biennale here called the Metropolis, where after that got inundated with letters, email letters, with notes, with calls of artists and architects and designers and anthropologists and God knows what, who wanted to get involved in this. It was about questioning the city and about actually questioning the realm of the public domain and how that became very important. And so again, you can feel that actually you're touching sort of barometer, you're touching something, you're touching a nerve somewhere in society.